Adolf Hitler hated Jewish people so much, he started a war to wipe them out. He blamed them for everything: Germany's problems, the world's problems, even his own failures. Millions believed his lies, and 6 million Jews were killed as a result. But why? Why did Hitler hate Jews so much? Let's find out. The early life of a future tyrant. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small town of Braunau am Inn, right on the border between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict customs officer, and his mother, Clara Pölzl, was gentle and deeply devoted to her children. The marriage was complicated. Alois and Clara were cousins and needed special permission from the Catholic Church to marry. Hitler was their 4th child, but 3 of his siblings died young. From early on, Adolf was a lonely and moody boy. His father beat him regularly. His school performance was strong at first, but as he got older, he began to fail on purpose, especially in subjects he didn't care for, just to spite his father. What stands out is how early Hitler's worldview began to form. As a young student, he was deeply influenced by a teacher named Leopold Pooch, who taught history with a heavy dose of nationalism. Pooch believed that Germany and Austria should be united, and that foreign influences, especially Jewish and Slavic cultures, were a threat to the purity of the German people. Hitler absorbed these ideas like a sponge. Even in his teenage years, he began to talk about the German nation as if it were under attack from within. At home, there was constant tension. Alois wanted his son to become a civil servant, just like him. But Adolf dreamed of being an artist. That dream clashed with reality. His father dismissed it as foolish, and their arguments grew worse. When Alois died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage in January 1903, Adolf was only 13. Though he cried at the funeral, he also felt free. With his main obstacle gone, he dropped out of school at 16 and pursued his art ambitions. But even as he chased that dream, Hitler was drawn more and more to political ideas, especially ones that placed blame on others for Germany's problems. He began reading the speeches of Georg von Schönerer, a radical Austrian politician who pushed for the Germanization of Austria and openly promoted anti-Jewish policies. Schönerer's 1882 Linz program called for removing Jews from public life and creating a racially pure German state. Hitler idolized him. These early influences didn't just teach Hitler to hate. They gave him a focus. They gave his anger a target. And for him, that target would increasingly become the Jews. Vienna, the crucible of prejudice. In 1907, Hitler's mother, Clara, died of breast cancer. She was just 47. Her death crushed him. He had watched her waste away during months of painful treatment, mostly handled by a Jewish doctor named Eduard Bloch. Hitler respected Bloch and sent him postcards and paintings after her death. Later, when Hitler became the Führer, Bloch was one of the few Jews allowed to emigrate freely. But that personal exception stood apart from what was growing inside him during the years that followed. Just a few months after his mother's death, Hitler moved to Vienna. It was 1908. He was 18 years old and full of dreams. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, hoping to become a painter. He was rejected, twice. The first time, he was told he had talent for architecture, but not for painting. But he didn't have a high school diploma, so that door was also closed. Without school, family, or work, Hitler drifted. By 1909, he was living in shelters, doing odd jobs to survive, shoveling snow, carrying luggage, painting cheap postcards to sell to tourists. Vienna was a huge, modern city. It was also full of political tension. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was made up of many different ethnic groups: Germans, Jews, Slavs, Hungarians, Czechs. And there was constant fighting over identity and power. Hitler already hated the empire's diversity, but Vienna gave his ideas direction. He found a villain in the Jewish population. The city's mayor, Karl Lueger, made anti-Jewish speeches and blamed Jews for nearly everything: banking, crime, liberal politics, and communism. He even revived old myths like blood libel, accusing Jews of using Christian blood in rituals. At the same time, Lueger was clever. He hired a Jewish deputy mayor and claimed he only meant the bad Jews, but his public words stuck. Hitler watched how Lueger gained power through fear and hate. He admired it. He copied it. This was when Hitler's anti-Semitism began to harden. His friend August Kubizek later recalled that Hitler didn't start out deeply anti-Jewish, but became more extreme while in Vienna. The more he struggled, the more he looked for someone to blame. He saw Jews as rich, educated, and successful, while he was poor, rejected, and angry. In his mind, Jews became the reason for his failure, and Vienna became the place where that hatred started to take shape. Munich: Flight, Identity, and Reinvention. In May 1913, Hitler packed his few belongings and left Vienna. He didn't just want a change of scenery, he was running. The Austro-Hungarian authorities had begun drafting young men into the army, and Hitler wanted no part in serving. He hated the idea of fighting for a multi-ethnic empire, one that mixed Germans with Czechs, Slavs, and Jews. To him, it felt like betrayal. He wanted to live among pure Germans. So he fled to Munich, a city in the German Empire, hoping to disappear into the crowds. At the time, Hitler was still technically an Austrian citizen, and leaving without permission made him a deserter. The law caught up with him in January 1914. He was arrested by the Munich police and brought in for questioning. But when the Austrians examined him, they decided he was unfit for military service. He had weak health, no real job, and no ties to the community. They let him go. This minor incident gave Hitler what he wanted: freedom from Austria and a new start in Germany. In Munich, Hitler began to see himself as part of something bigger. He had escaped the empire he despised. He was living among people who, in his eyes, were racially and culturally superior. But even here, his resentment toward Jews kept growing. Munich had a large Jewish community and was politically active, especially on the left. Socialists, communists, and revolutionaries, some of them Jewish, held rallies and printed newspapers calling for change. Hitler, already bitter about his failures and his poverty, saw these people as dangerous. He didn't understand their politics, but he hated how confident and organized they were. He blamed them for weakening traditional German values and culture. This idea that Jews were behind both capitalism and communism started to settle in his mind. It was a strange mix, but one that made sense to Hitler. He believed Jews were controlling both ends of the system, bankers in one hand, revolutionaries in the other. No matter where he looked, he thought they were behind the scenes, pulling the strings. In Munich, away from the empire he had fled, Hitler wasn't letting go of his hate. He was sharpening it. World War I: Trauma, Radicalization, and Myth-Making. When World War I broke out in August 1914, Adolf Hitler found a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He volunteered for the Bavarian army, even though he wasn't a German citizen, and was accepted. That one moment changed everything for him. The army gave him structure, a place to belong, and something to believe in. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, delivering orders between trenches under heavy fire. It was dangerous work, but Hitler was proud of it. He took pride in his obedience and endurance. In December 1914, he earned the Iron Cross, second class. 4 years later, in August 1918, he was awarded the Iron Cross, first class, an award rarely given to someone of his rank. The officer who recommended him was Jewish, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann. The war brought horror. Hitler fought in the First Battle of Ypres, where thousands of German soldiers died. He was wounded during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and temporarily blinded by mustard gas near the end of the war in 1918. He was sent to a hospital in Passewalk to recover. It was there, lying in a military bed with bandages over his eyes, that he received the news. Germany had surrendered. The armistice had been signed on November 11, 1918. The war was over. Germany had lost. That news hit Hitler like a thunderbolt. He couldn't believe it. To him, Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. He blamed the politicians back home, the new democratic leaders who signed the armistice. Many of them were Jewish or socialist, or both. The pain and humiliation of defeat twisted into anger. He convinced himself that Germany had been betrayed from within. This idea, that Jews and leftists had stabbed the army in the back, wasn't something he invented. It was already spreading in nationalist circles, but Hitler clung to it and never let go. The stab in the back myth became the seed of his political rage. He believed Germany had been humiliated by cowardly leaders who didn't care about the nation. And in his eyes, Jews were always involved. Even though Jewish soldiers had fought and died in the trenches beside him, even though one had helped him earn a medal, Hitler ignored all that. He needed someone to blame. The Protocols of Zion, a lie that lit the fire. After the war, Germany was in ruins. Millions were dead, cities were shattered, and people were angry, poor, and looking for someone to blame. That's when a book began to spread. A small booklet with big lies. It was called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It claimed to be a secret Jewish plan for world domination. It described meetings of Jewish leaders who supposedly plotted to control the press, the economy, politics, and culture. It said they planned to ruin Christian nations from the inside. But the book was a forgery. It wasn't written by Jewish leaders. It was made up in 1903 by Russian anti-Semites, probably by a man named Pavel Khrushchev. They copied parts of an earlier political satire written in France and replaced the characters with Jewish names. It was all fake, but that didn't stop it from spreading. The Protocols made its way across Europe after the 1917 Russian Revolution, when communism took over. Many people feared communism and thought Jews were behind it. This led to the term Judeo-Bolshevism, the idea that Jews and communists were working together to destroy Western civilization. The Protocols helped spread that fear. It was translated into dozens of languages. In Germany, it appeared in 1919. In America, even Henry Ford promoted it through a series of newspaper articles and pamphlets titled The International Jew. Ford had factories in Germany and was admired by many nationalists, including Hitler. One of the people who introduced Hitler to the Protocols was Alfred Rosenberg, an early Nazi and the author of The Myth of the 20th Century. Rosenberg believed the Jews were behind both capitalism and communism, and that Aryans were the true creators of culture. Hitler took these ideas and folded them into his worldview. He believed the Protocols were proof that Jews weren't just a religion or a minority group. They were, in his mind, a global threat. In Mein Kampf, written in the 1920s, Hitler referred to the Protocols as evidence of this conspiracy. Even though it was proven false many times, Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, continued to promote it. They didn't care if it was real. It supported what they already believed. The quiet rise of a dangerous demagogue. After Germany's defeat in World War I, everything felt uncertain. The empire had collapsed. The economy was sinking. Soldiers were returning home to poverty, bitterness, and a country they no longer recognized. In this confusion, Adolf Hitler found a new place to channel his anger. He joined a small intelligence unit of the Bavarian army, which had one job: spy on political groups considered dangerous to the state. In September 1919, that mission took him to a meeting of a tiny nationalist group called the German Workers' Party. But instead of just listening, Hitler ended up speaking. His sharp tongue and aggressive views caught the attention of the group's founder, Anton Drexler, who quickly invited him to join. That same month, Hitler wrote a letter responding to what was known as the Jewish question. In it, he described Jews not as a religion, but as a race, one that, he said, posed a threat to the health of Germany. He wrote that Jews must be removed, a word that sounded vague but carried a dangerous meaning. This was no longer about political disagreement or even religious dislike. For Hitler, Jews were not individuals. They were part of a race he saw as poisoning the nation from the inside. By October 1919, Hitler had started giving public speeches. The first one took place at a beer hall in Munich. It wasn't large, around 100 people, but his style was powerful. He shouted, he blamed, he promised, and the crowd listened. His speeches focused on betrayal, humiliation, and the need for a pure Germany. The Jews, he said, were at the center of it all. He blamed them for the war, for the Treaty of Versailles, for communism, for capitalism, for everything that had gone wrong. In 1920, the group changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what we now call the Nazi Party. They also published a 25-point program. It called for stripping Jews of German citizenship, banning Jewish immigration, and removing Jews from all positions of influence. It wasn't hidden. It was printed, spoken, and repeated. By 1921, Hitler had forced his way into leadership of the party. He was no longer just shouting in beer halls. He was building something bigger. The hatred had found a home. The Gamlick Letter, blueprint of a genocidal mind. In September 1919, just weeks after joining the German Workers' Party, Hitler wrote a letter that would later be seen as one of the earliest written records of his deadly ideas. The letter was addressed to a fellow soldier named Adolf Gamlick. On the surface, it looked like a formal reply to a request for information about the Jewish question. But inside, it revealed much more. It was a window into how Hitler had already begun to shape his beliefs into a political weapon. In the letter, Hitler laid out what he claimed was a rational kind of antisemitism. He made a point to say that hatred based on emotion, like violent outbursts or mob attacks, was not useful. What he believed in was structured, thought out, and systematic rejection of the Jewish people. He did not see Jews as just followers of a different religion. He described them as a separate race, one that he claimed was using money, media, and politics to control nations from within. According to him, Jews were not German and could never be, no matter how long they lived in Germany or how much they contributed to society. The most chilling part of the letter came when he argued that the only way to solve this so-called problem was through what he called the uncompromising removal of the Jews. The German word he used was Entfernung. It can mean removal, expulsion, or even extermination. Historians still debate exactly how far Hitler meant to go at that early stage, but whether he was calling for forced deportation or already imagining mass murder, the direction was clear. He was not interested in tolerance, integration, or reform. He was imagining a Germany without Jews at all. The Gamlick Letter didn't attract much attention at the time. It was written on military letterhead and signed by a man barely known outside of party meetings, but it would later be used as legal evidence of premeditation. It showed that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not a passing feeling. It wasn't random or reactionary. It was part of a growing worldview that blamed an entire group of people for the country's problems, and that demanded they be removed entirely. Versailles and Balffor, fueling a politics of revenge. After World War I, Germany was in ruins, its economy shattered, its people humiliated, and its borders redrawn by foreign powers. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, forced Germany to accept full blame for the war. It stripped the country of territories, reduced its military, and demanded massive reparations that crushed the already struggling economy. Hitler saw this treaty not just as a political mistake, but as a deep betrayal. In his view, Germany had not been defeated in battle, but stabbed in the back by internal enemies. And for him, the enemy behind the betrayal was always the same: the Jews. To Hitler, the Treaty of Versailles was more than just unfair. He believed it was proof that Jews held secret power over the world. He repeated a lie that had already spread in German nationalist circles: that Jewish politicians, bankers, and communists had sabotaged the war effort from within just to profit off Germany's destruction. This myth became one of the key weapons in Hitler's speeches, helping him turn public anger away from generals and emperors and toward a racial scapegoat. He made it seem like every German failure, from defeat in war to hunger in the streets, was the result of a Jewish plot. At the same time, in 1917, before the war ended, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. This was a public letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour supporting the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For most of the world, it was a gesture of support after centuries of Jewish persecution. But to Hitler, it was more proof that Jews were gaining international power and pushing for their own state at the expense of others. He didn't see the Balfour Declaration as a humanitarian effort. He saw it as part of a global conspiracy. Hitler was not interested in the idea of giving Jews their own homeland. He rejected it completely. In his mind, Jews didn't deserve a state. They didn't deserve to exist. Instead of supporting relocation, he pushed toward extermination. He believed that the Jews had to be removed from the world, not just from Germany. And the treaty and declaration together gave him fuel for that hatred. The beer hall Pooch and the writing of Mein Kampf. In November 1923, Hitler saw his chance to seize power. Along with other Nazi party members, he stormed a beer hall in Munich where Bavarian leaders were meeting. His plan was simple: force them to support his revolution, march to Berlin, and take control of Germany. It didn't work. The beer hall Pooch collapsed the next day. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested, charged with treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. He only served 8 months, but those 8 months changed everything. Inside his prison cell, Hitler had time to think, write, and shape his ideas into something more dangerous. With help from fellow Nazi Rudolf Hess, he began writing his book, which would later become infamous: Mein Kampf. The original title was longer: 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. But what mattered more than the name were the ideas inside. He laid out his hatred of Jews in full. He didn't hide it behind politics or laws. He called Jews parasites who spread disease and ruin nations. He said they were the root cause of communism, capitalism, and moral decay. He warned that unless the Jews were removed, Germany would never rise again. In the book, Hitler also repeated the lies from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, treating it like truth. He didn't care that it had been exposed as a forgery. He called it proof that Jews wanted to control the world. He mixed this conspiracy theory with ideas of racial superiority. He claimed the Aryan race, especially Germans, were meant to rule the world, and Jews were its natural enemies. He talked about Lebensraum, a plan to expand eastward, especially into Russia, to give Germans more living space. That space would come at the cost of Slavs and Jews, who he believed needed to be wiped out. Mein Kampf became a bestseller once Hitler gained power. By 1934, it had sold 1 million copies. Newlyweds received it as a gift. Students were expected to read it. It wasn't just a book, it was a roadmap. Every page built the case for hatred, and every sentence moved Germany closer to mass murder. Hitler's war on the Jews was no longer hidden. It was printed, published, and read across the country. The Jewish child Hitler refused to abandon. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and the first concentration camps were opening, a little girl visited his mountain retreat at Obersalzberg. Her name was Bernile Nienau. She was 6 years old, with bright blue eyes and golden blonde hair. Features Hitler admired and believed represented the so-called Aryan ideal. Bernile shared a birthday with him, April 20th, and the two formed an unusual friendship. She called him Uncle Adolf, and he responded with warmth, calling her his darling. For several years, the girl and her mother were allowed to visit Hitler's estate. They took photos together. They exchanged letters. On the surface, it looked innocent, a powerful man entertaining a child's affection. But the story had a strange twist. Bernile was part Jewish. Her maternal grandmother was Jewish, which, under the Nazi racial laws that were still taking shape, meant Bernile herself was classified as 1/4 Jewish. Hitler knew. His aides knew. Still, he allowed the friendship to continue, at least for a while. Some of his inner circle, like photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, even published pictures of them together. But not everyone approved. Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest lieutenants, saw the relationship as dangerous. It didn't match the racial narrative the regime was building. By 1938, Bormann intervened. He banned Bernile and her mother from returning to Obersalzberg and made sure the photos were pulled from future publications. The ones already printed sold well, but were quietly removed later. Bormann insisted that Hitler be protected from criticism, even if that meant cutting off a child. Bernile's letters show that she adored Hitler. In one, she told his staff that she was knitting socks for him so his feet would stay warm while traveling. Her mother, Caroline, seemed to support the friendship too. But after their exile from Hitler's inner circle, their contact ended. Bernile died of spinal polio on October 5, 1943, in a hospital in Munich. She was 17. She left behind letters, memories, and a story that didn't fit the usual image of Hitler. He had built a movement based on racial purity and hatred for Jews, yet had once embraced a girl with Jewish ancestry. Some have tried to use this story to soften Hitler's image, but it doesn't erase what followed. The racial doctrine that justified mass murder. The Nazi racial worldview was built on one core idea, that not all human beings were equal. Hitler believed that Germans, especially those of Nordic descent, were the master race. He called them Aryans and placed them at the top of a racial ladder. Beneath them were the so-called subhumans, Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others who didn't fit the Nazi ideal. This idea wasn't new. It borrowed from older racist theories that had floated through Europe in the 19th century. But Hitler took it further. He didn't just believe in racial difference, he believed in racial war. He saw Jews not as a religious group, but as a dangerous race. one that threatened the survival of Germany. This ideology took shape in laws. On September 15, 1935, the Nazi regime passed the Nuremberg Laws. These stripped Jews of German citizenship and made marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews illegal. It defined who was Jewish not by religion or practice, but by ancestry. If you had Jewish grandparents, you were marked. Thousands of people were suddenly outsiders in their own country. They lost jobs, homes, education, and legal protection. It didn't stop there. In 1939, the Nazis began the euthanasia program, targeting the mentally and physically disabled. These people were considered a burden to the racial future. At least 70,000 were murdered in secret gas chambers long before the Holocaust began. Then came the final solution. In January 1942, top Nazi officials gathered at the Wannsee Conference near Berlin. There, they discussed a plan to murder all Jews in Europe, around 11 million people. The idea wasn't debated. It was accepted. What followed was the Holocaust. Jews were rounded up from homes, ghettos, and camps, loaded onto trains, and sent to extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Some were shot in mass graves by mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen. Others were gassed in sealed chambers disguised as showers. Children, the elderly, entire families disappeared. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been murdered. It wasn't a spontaneous act of war. It was the cold, planned result of a hatred Hitler had nurtured for decades, turned into law, and executed by a government that believed killing was cleansing.